Welcome. This webinar was originally recorded on April 7th, 2020 by Counterpoint Sustainable Real Estate and White & Williams LLP. My name is Adam Moskowitz, and we welcome you to the first of a four-part webinar series. In this, we will cover the basics of PACE as they are being introduced to the Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania markets. I'm going to pass the microphone in a moment to Mary Rose Meritus from the Philadelphia Energy Authority, who will give a brief introduction. She will in turn pass the microphone to Eric Alini, managing partner at Counterpoint Sustainable Real Estate. And last but not least, we will pass the microphone to Tim Davis from White & Williams, where he is a partner. At the end, we'll open up the microphones for Q&A, and we'll hear what everybody has to say. So thank you for joining us, and without further ado, here is Mary Rose.
Great, thank you, Adam, for that introduction. So, CPACE, Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy, is here in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia specifically. As many of you know, CPACE is a financing tool that allows property owners to borrow money to pay for certain types of projects that create measurable savings, and the financing is repaid via a special assessment similar to a property tax assessment. Philadelphia is very excited to have CPACE here in our city, as we see it as a great tool to help advance the city's sustainability goals. Philadelphia set the goal of reducing our carbon footprint by 80% by 2050, in line with the Paris Climate Accord. And about 80% of our carbon right now comes from buildings and industry. So we see a ton of opportunity for the types of projects that CPACE can finance here in our city. CPACE covers a number of different projects, primarily falling into three different buckets: energy efficiency, renewable energy, and water conservation projects. All of these projects can provide substantial support for these carbon footprint reduction goals. And one of the things that's great about CPACE in this environment is that it's really a public-private partnership that brings private capital to the city and to the state to help support these environmental goals. It's a long-term secure form of debt, and especially in this economic environment right now where we see a lot of uncertainty, it's a really safe financial asset because it's assessment-based. As I mentioned before, it's an assessment on a property similar to a property tax assessment that's used to repay the financing. So we're really happy to have this competitive capital in our market now to provide funding for these energy efficiency, clean energy, and water conservation projects that not only are good for the environment, but also help create jobs in the city and beyond. Moving on to some CPACE financing highlights. First, a big one that I want to cover is that CPACE can be used to finance 100% of the project costs related to those three buckets of energy efficiency, water conservation, and renewable energy. This doesn't mean that you can use CPACE to cover 100% of your project costs for building an entirely new building, but it can be used to cover 100% of the project costs that are related to the CPACE program, so related to energy efficiency, water, and clean energy. CPACE is a cheaper source of capital for projects that often end up saving money because of the efficiencies they create, and that money, that cash savings, usually results in a positive NOI for the property from day one. CPACE also provides long-term fixed rates, and these rates are often competitive with mezzanine debt and equity, as I'll discuss on the next slide. And finally, CPACE provides flexible prepayment options. This is really key for property owners who want to take on these cost-saving, energy-saving, greener improvements to their buildings, but don't necessarily know how long they'll be holding on to their buildings, or maybe pursuing a buy and flip model, or they might be long-term holders of the buildings. So really having the ability to be flexible about your prepayment options in a CPACE financing means that you can customize this tool for a number of different purposes that developers and property owners are seeking. A couple financing features for CPACE that are definitely worth pointing out. First one is that CPACE really helps reduce the need for value engineering in projects. So, a lot of times, especially when you're doing a new construction project and you've got a large capital budget, and you have to find places to find cuts, energy efficiency upgrades, green energy projects can be pretty early to get onto the cutting board. But CPACE actually helps reduce the cost to finance these types of projects, allowing property owners to keep them within their plan from the beginning, allowing property owners to install these energy conservation measures that create this positive cash flow and do it at affordable financing. CPACE provides low rates and long-term financing for property owners and developers looking at those three types of projects: energy efficiency, water conservation, and renewable energy. And what we've seen, in the market is rates in the high 5s, 6s, 7s. So as you can see, it could be very competitive against mezzanine debt, especially when you're building a capital stack with lots of different sources of capital. And bringing in this cheaper cost of capital to offset mezz debt or equity helps bring down your overall weighted average cost of capital. So CPACE can be really helpful in these large projects as well. Finally, CPACE is a form of non-recourse financing. Because CPACE is similar to a property tax assessment, the financing is non-recourse to the borrower and there are no personal guarantees required. So we're really excited to have CPACE here in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania at large. And it's a new financing tool available for commercial property owners here. But CPACE is actually not that new of a tool. In fact, it's been legislatively enabled in about 36 states already across the country. There have been over $1 billion of CPACE deals struck through Q3 of 2019 alone across the country. And when we see the rest of the 2019 results come in, we expect to see pretty impressive numbers. Moving on to CPACE in Pennsylvania specifically, in summer of 2018, the state capitol passed CPACE enabling legislation, which allows each county in the state to approve and set up its own CPACE program to allow businesses within those counties to take out CPACE financing for the purposes discussed before. To date, 9 counties have adopted CPACE, and when you're looking at the map, you might see a lot of gray here, but what's important to note is that the green counties that have passed CPACE legislation already are major business centers in the state. So you see Philadelphia over on the southeast corner of the state. We passed and enabled CPACE legislation in summer of 2019 and launched our program in Q4 of 2019. Allegheny County over on the west side of the state, that's where Pittsburgh is, another major metropolitan area in the state. And you see in the Lehigh Valley, we've got Lehigh and Northampton counties, both with CPACE already enabled. Anecdotally, what we're seeing across the state is an appeal for CPACE for a lot of different types of projects. We're seeing older buildings interested in retrofits, looking at CPACE financing. We're seeing property owners and developers looking at brand new construction, building CPACE into their capital stack to, as I mentioned before, reduce their overall weighted cost of capital and continue to include energy efficiency and green energy measures in the buildings they're putting together. We're seeing all 3 buckets of projects too across Philadelphia: rooftop solar, ground-mounted solar, energy efficiency, water conservation. We're really seeing CPACE has wide appeal to property owners and developers in the state. We're very happy to see that. One thing I'd like to note before we move on is that you might see a lot of gray here on this slide. And if you know of any property owners or projects going on in any of these counties, we'd love to hear from you, because having a concrete project in hand is a great way to help convince the county to move the CPACE enabling legislation over the finish line and get a program up and running. So if you see anything here where you would like to see CPACE take place, reach out and we'll get you in touch with the right people.
Thank you very much, Mary Rose, for helping out on learning about PACE in Pennsylvania. CPACE core property types are generally across the board in normal real estate types of properties. We have done transactions in hospitality, in retail, in industrial, in office, in multifamily, in both retrofit and new construction. Next slide, please. The key to PACE for multi-tenant properties is that it allows tenants to perform retrofit type transactions or projects and still achieve off-balance sheet treatment because PACE is a tax. It is not a loan, and therefore taxes are sitting on your income statement. It is non-recourse, fully amortizing with no financial covenants. There are no financial guarantees required. Obviously, the property-based credit rather than owner's credit, and it qualifies to help the financial health of the building. Obviously, taxes transfer upon sale of a property. They move, the new owner might pay the taxes, so there's no residual encumbrances and therefore allows for an easy exit. Next slide, please. One of the nice things about CPACE is that it allows owners to solve the split incentive issue. In a commercial property, often, particularly if the retrofit is fixing old equipment or materials, that cost comes out of the property owner, and he's unable to pass on those improvements to a highly efficient HVAC, for example, to the tenants. Because PACE is a tax, there is an advantage to having a triple net or modified gross lease. In both of those cases, the taxes, the insurance, and utilities are passed on to the tenants. That allows, depending on the lease structure, the split incentive to be passed over to the tenant. Next slide, please. PACE for financing for hotels has been very effective in the same manner. It can be used efficiently for PIPs, property improvement plans that may be mandated by the franchise, or in a new construction will help finance up to 25% of the estimated property value. Some hotel chains and franchises allow the CPACE cost to be passed as a green tax, charged off to each of the guests in order to recapture those green costs. Next slide. CPACE for multifamily properties is not yet available in Pennsylvania, and I know the Philadelphia Energy Authority is working very hard to get that approved at a state level. We have used multifamily PACE for both retrofits as well as new builds, and they've used it for HVAC, windows, doors, insulation, seismic improvements, a whole host of opportunistic retrofits for both affordable housing and for workforce housing. Freddie Mac and FHA have enabled PACE. Freddie Mac does provide lender consent for CPACE, which you can see on their website in the Green Advantage program. And the FHA is also approved in certain states for CPACE. Next slide, please. What you're seeing now is a prototypical multifamily transaction that we have done here at Counterpoint. This is a deal we closed about a week ago. It was a $14 million CPACE financing on a ground-up multifamily in California. And we would hope to see additional opportunities like this in Pennsylvania. This particular PACE was 22% loan to value and was used for seismic, HVAC, building envelope, lighting, and roofing. It saved roughly, reduced roughly 211 megawatts per year in savings, reduced water conservation, and actually had a carbon reduction count that we think is very effective for the environment. We look forward to working with the Philadelphia Energy Authority on getting multifamily approved. We think this is prototypical for all the different types of transactions that might become available in the Pennsylvania area. And now over to Tim to discuss legal.
Eric, thank you so much for that presentation. Let's talk briefly about some of the legal aspects of CPACE next. The first key legal document in a CPACE transaction is a promissory note. The promissory note will look an awful lot like a promissory note from a real estate transaction. It will, however, not be secured by a mortgage or a deed of trust. The second document that will be between the property owner and the CPACE capital provider is the financing agreement. And the financing agreement will look an awful lot like a loan agreement from a real estate transaction. It will have representations, warranties, covenants, events of default, and remedies. The third key document is called a Statement of Levy and Lien of Assessment Agreement. And this document is on the website of the Philadelphia Energy Authority. It's a four-party agreement among the CPACE capital provider, the borrower, the City of Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia Energy Authority. This is really the guts of the transaction in terms of the recognition of the assessment, how it will be administered, and various rights and remedies that will flow among the four parties. The next important legal document is the mortgage lender consent. And we'll talk a little bit more about this document in a moment. But keep in mind that pursuant to the recently passed ordinance in Philadelphia, this document has a central role in a CPACE transaction, as it is required in order to consummate a CPACE financing. Also, keep in mind that there will be no intercreditor agreement between the mortgage lender and the CPACE capital provider. In the context of a mezzanine loan and a mortgage loan, where an intercreditor agreement would play a central role, in a CPACE financing transaction, this agreement does not have a place in the capital stack. Next. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the mortgage lender consent. One, keep in mind it is absolutely required by the recently enacted Philadelphia ordinance. This is not unusual. It is certainly envisioned by many other pieces of legislation in other jurisdictions. Two things to really keep in mind here. One, it raises the issue of communication. And really the theme here is communication, communication, communication. The sponsor needs to advise the mortgage lender as early on in the process, in the same way it would if it was seeking a preferred equity investment or a mezzanine loan investment, that it envisions having CPACE as part of the capital stack. CPACE is new, largely new to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. So the concept for lenders who will be financing projects in Philadelphia and elsewhere will become increasingly prevalent for lenders to consider. Many lenders in other jurisdictions where CPACE has been on the books for longer have gotten comfortable with CPACE and consented to it as part of their overall capital stack. Also keep in mind that many lenders, when evaluating a CPACE transaction, will think about it from a perspective of an opportunity to escrow for the CPACE assessments in their own loan documents. And this is frankly a win-win, because the CPACE provider has the peace of mind that the ultimate assessments are being escrowed for, and the senior lender has the peace of mind that the CPACE assessments will be paid for in the normal course during the transaction. Next. And finally, just a few of the fundamental legal characteristics of CPACE. It's important to keep in mind that CPACE is not a loan, but rather a statutorily enacted special assessment. Also keep in mind its priority vis-a-vis a mortgage loan. The priority of a CPACE assessment is akin to a real estate tax, and that is to say it is senior to the mortgage loan in priority. Also, CPACE assessments run with the land. That is to say, upon the sale or transfer of the underlying property, the assessment continues to burden the property under the new property owner's period of ownership. There is not, unlike a mortgage loan, for example, a concept of due on sale, where the property, if the property is sold, the entire loan is generally due in full. And then finally, in terms of enforcement and the scenario under which a CPACE assessment is not being paid in a timely way, the failure to pay the assessment can result in the foreclosure by the sheriff's office. Much like the failure to pay a real estate tax can result in a foreclosure for the unpaid taxes. Keep in mind, however, that only the delinquent amounts can be foreclosed. So that is to say, the assessment cannot be accelerated in the event of a failure to pay an annual assessment. So I hope this overview of some of the legal aspects of CPACE documentation and the underlying legal characteristics of CPACE has been helpful.
Okay, thank you guys. I have gotten a couple of questions in from text, so we're going to sort those out. And then I think we're going to unmute others who, just because there's a few questions, I think the best path to do is I'm going to unmute people who have the questions. So it's going to just take me a second to find them. So Ben Block, if you want to find yourself, you're going to, well, first let me unmute my panelists here. So let me get Tim unmuted, and let me get Eric unmuted, and let me get Mary Rose unmuted here real quick. Where are you, Mary Rose? Oh, Mary Rose is unmuted, I think. There we go. Okay. So then Ben Block, if you want to prepare to get yourself unmuted, here you go. I'm going to put in a little unmute on Ben. Ben has asked, well, Ben, you could ask your questions. They were good questions, hotels and such. So let's have at it. Ben, you're unmuted. If you agree to it, I think you might have got a message on your phone that says you're unmuted.
Unmute now.
All right, there you go, Ben.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, thank you. Okay, yeah, so I had two questions. Let's do one at a time. Retroactive loans, I was just wondering if, so I know that that's allowed by the program and affiliating across the state, but I guess my question was more how the capital providers see those and kind of what, maybe talk about what examples of past projects where, in what scenarios was a property owner interested in retroactive financing, and whether the current market conditions, given the current state of commercial lending, whether what scenarios you might foresee or why property owners would be interested in it moving forward, or at least during this interim period of uncertainty.
Yeah, before we approach that topic, since I have privy to what your second question is, which is about hotels and your interest in financing that, I think we can probably combine the answer because many hotels go through retrofits. So maybe if I can just, for the sake of expediency, I'm going to pass that microphone, I think, to Eric, and then maybe Mary Rose, you want to jump in too, as far as retroactive financing goes. But retroactive financing, and then if you could tip your cap to the hotel industry and maybe talk about current market conditions there, I think that would be helpful. Would that be good, Ben? Well, Ben muted himself. I assume he's very happy with my resolution. Let's go. Eric, take it away on retrofits and then a little bit on hotels if you can.
Sure. So on the concept of refinance and retrofits, in a few cases, we have done a refinancing. Often it will be in relation to a new project. So the property owner had come to us first filling out or finding out about PACE. And then as we're having the conversation with them, they may have just completed one project and PACE came to them and or their city for a second project. And then we go back in and refinance the one they just completed. That tends to be early in a program. So I think Mary Rose will see a lot of those because PACE has just come on board, and a good conversation that we have is, oh, great, we'd love to do your HVAC. Have you done anything else in recent history? And then they'll say, oh, yes, I just did my windows. And they'll say, I said, great, we'll be able to do not just the HVAC unit, but the windows that you might be doing. So we see that as one typical process. And I can think of 3 or 4 deals, and one we're closing now, that represents probably about 25 to 30% of this very large project we're working on, because they just didn't know PACE was available, and now it is. The second type you tend to get would be, again, upon learning about PACE, and they come back to us and say, look, I'd like to get some of that money back out, much to their need for fixing that split incentive, right? They had an old HVAC unit, it failed, or they needed to replace it, and then they learn about the ability to pass that through, and they realize that that's got a great value to them because they spent the $5 million on the HVAC unit. Now they can actually recoup some of it through the PACE. By the way, in the split incentive situation, they're passing the lower energy costs to their tenants. So now they say, oh, look, this is a great way to do it. So that's the second way. And your comment about hotels, yes. I mean, obviously, in the current market conditions, hotels are a very difficult asset class right now. I don't think and I'm an old commercial lender, I've done this for a long time, I don't think I've ever modeled 30% occupancies on a hotel that was running at 80s in a 3-week period. That being said, we're able to get PACE deals done. In fact, we're trying to close a $5 million PACE hotel loan as we speak. The problem has now arisen with the senior lender. It's the senior lender that sort of pulled the reins up because they're unable to understand where they are. I think that's just how the market's going to be for the next, call it, 3 months or so, as senior lenders begin to, understand where the market is, and then whether we end up with a U, a V, or a W recovery here. So hotels are a great opportunity for PACE. They have been. We recently closed a $22 million PACE deal in a hotel. So we like hotels, but in the current market conditions, the senior lenders are the ones who seem to be, sort of pulling up the reins. And since we need lender consent, as Tim had said earlier, that tends to kind of muck up the works on the hotel process. Mary Rose, you may want to talk about the first 2 points or both points.
Sure. I mean, Eric, I think you really covered the bulk of it. I'll just say from a program admin point of view, Ben, you're right. As you said, retroactive financing is available in the Philly program and in the other programs active in the state so far. And it's a 2-year look-back window subject to certain restrictions. If your project was basically completed under an old code, so, Philadelphia is operating under the 2018 IECC, but some projects that are, just getting completed now or have been completed in the past year or so were completed under an old code, then the requirement is that you have to exceed that old code requirement by 20%. So just fun facts on refinancing in Philadelphia. But I can, speak to more to that to anyone who's interested.
Always good. Thank you, Mary Rose. In listening to Eric's response to Ben and then Mary Rose's response, I'm just going to throw in, Eric threw in a lot of big deals and a lot of big numbers. Mary Rose, from the administrator perspective, what are the approximate size deals you see happening in the program, and what was the program designed for? Obviously, we know some of the scale, but how small does this get?
Sure. So in Philadelphia, our minimum project financing size is $100,000. And actually in the other programs up and running in the state, they're willing to go down to $10,000. So it's a bit of a range. But in Philly, we've got a floor at 100,000. And, anecdotally, from what we're seeing in our market, market is we're seeing from that $100,000 mark to tens of millions of dollars. So it really ranges. It depends on what the property owner is looking to do, how many energy and water measures they're really putting in, and the level of work being done on the building. I think we've got a lot of CPACE experts on the phone who can probably quote this number better than I can, but I think the national average on a CPACE deal is around $500,000.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go to the chat questions that we received, and since it's going well this way, we'll keep it up. I promised to unmute everybody, but I'm sure there's some dogs barking in the background and all that, so we'll keep everybody on mute. I'm going to go to Ryan Haast's question. Ryan, rather than unmuting, I'm just going to read it. If you want to yell at me in chat, tell me to do so. Ryan asked, any idea when CPACE for multifamily development will be improved in PA? Probably another Mary Rose question. So thoughts on that, Mary Rose?
Sure, that's a great question and a hot topic for us. We would really like to include multifamily in our CPACE program here in Philly and across the state. Unfortunately, that will require a fix in Harrisburg, and we have been planning to do kind of a robust push on that front in the second quarter of this year, leading up to the budget process in Harrisburg. Obviously, Harrisburg is facing different budget challenges than they maybe thought they were going to be facing just a couple months ago. So we're kind of trying to figure out the best way to move that forward. So unfortunately, I don't have a great solid timeline for you on that front, although we are anxious to get it involved as well.
Okay, I am scrolling, thank you, Mary Rose. I'm scrolling through the questions and I'm seeing, I sent out, let's see, Jerry said, CPACE is non-participating mezz also. That seems more of a comment than a question. If you want to, if you want to rephrase that in text, please do so. And I got one privately. Oh, Ryan, thank you. I'm glad you liked our rephrasing of your question. And let's see, we have a question coming in privately. It was Tim, this one's for Tim Davis. What's the approximate length of time to close? How long does all this PACE stuff take to bring to bear? Tim?
I think Tim's on mute.
Oh, I got to unmute Tim. I tried to. He didn't accept my unmuting. Let's see. Tim, I'm trying to unmute you. Mary Rose, you could. Tim is unmuted. Let's go with Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for watching out for me, Mary Rose.
Sure.
So I think really it's probably a joint question between the two of us, but I think there is an added element of time added on to a CPACE transaction. Say we were normally looking at a non-CPACE mortgage loan transaction. Perhaps people have circled through 30 days, which is probably honestly on the fast side, given issues that'll come up. But say it's somewhere in the normal gestation is 60 days. I think CPACE can move very quickly so long as, again, there is communication with Mary Rose's office and getting in her queue early. So at the end of the day, I think so long as people are communicating early on and processing the relevant documentation, I think it's fair to say there may be some additional time, but it needn't be material. And certainly it can be, if people are talking and communicating, can all be running parallel. And I don't know, Mary Rose, if that's what you're seeing, but I think the faster people are in your office and talking to the senior lender, to Eric's point, the better.
Yes, I totally agree. I think that early communication, kind of dual tracking different workflows, talking to the senior lender early, and also getting on top of the energy conservation measures survey, which is required with every final application. Those are kind of the key ways to make this move quickly. Just from I'd be curious to hear what Eric has to say about, how he talks to potential clients about the timeline from Counterpoint's perspective, but just from a program admin point of view, I'll say we have a two-stage application process, a pre-application, which is very short, takes very little time to fill out, and we commit to reviewing that and returning a response within 10 business days. Oftentimes it's much shorter than that. And then a final application, which does have more requirements, including that mortgage consent document, the ECM survey that I mentioned, and a couple other documents. And that we commit to turning around within 15 business days. So that's, some time to build into your expected calendar. But that time period when we're reviewing things, you can be working on other components of the project and moving forward with the financing agreement at the same time. So it can be dual tracked.
Yeah, Mario. So that, I think your time frames are terrific. There are some programs out there, and we run 3 different programs ourselves. We try and get to the same time frames as you do. A lot of times it's also the engineering that is required that adds a bit of time to it, because you're often trying to explain to the engineer exactly what they want, what we want, and what you want. And sometimes the engineer, you've got a great engineer on the other side that works well. If you've got an engineer on the other side that only knows an ASHRAE 2, that adds a lot of time. So I think your time frames are terrific. Usually we tell people it's 30 to 60 days, and you're exactly correct. It often matters what the consenting lender has to do, because a lot of times you're also teaching them pace. Just because you've done a deal with JP Morgan, an operation of that size and magnitude, you have to reteach a different group on what it means. So there's a little bit of educational process for the senior lender that goes on.
All right, thank you, Eric. So some more texts and group chats have come in here. So Mary Rose did answer one live to everyone. So Jerry asked, where are the program guidelines posted online? And in case not everyone's reading the chat, Mary Rose answered, you can find them on philadelphiacpace.org. And feel free to reach out with any questions. Okay, so so if you need program guidelines, the PEA site has them. philadelphiacpace.org has them. Okay, so Ben Block had another question. I'm going to read it out loud here so we don't have to unmute Ben again. With retroactive, I read some CAP providers are allowing delayed loan payments up to 2 years. Is that standard or is that specific to each provider? So I think I'll let Eric answer on behalf of us, and then I'm sure he knows the industry well enough to give the weather report, but Mary Rose can chime in as well. So Eric.
Sure. So Ben, I think the question first is, by delayed loan payments, is it a capitalized interest? So we generally will capitalize interest for transactions both in the retrofit / new construction. They tend to be longer in the new construction stage, simply because it allows you to not have to pay the taxes out of pocket and capitalize it. Generally, we go out to 3 years in our new construction projects. If you're referring to more of a loan forgiveness part, that has not happened yet that I've seen in the PACE. And if you're really looking to delay just because you need loan forgiveness, that's a different question. But again, capitalized interest definitely is a usable structure inside of the PACE world. Hopefully that you've answered that answers what you're looking for. Mary Rose?
Yeah, I think Eric covered it. Makes a whole lot of sense. We don't have a problem with that approach in our program. So it's really on a capital provider basis and what you work out with them.
Okay. I'm returning back. Ben, if we didn't answer that good enough, throw back in another question. Thank you. As an active participant, there's Jerry is asking, as a PACE project developer, he's asking about fees and how to price a project with environmental appraisal lender, all that. So I'm going to interpret that as an estimation of, or a discussion of some of the fees that are involved. Now, some of this is for our next webinar. So you are stealing a little thunder from our next webinar about the, sort of lifting up the kimono and sort of seeing what else is in a deal. So we will talk about that again in a future webinar, but why don't we talk broadly about fees, and any of my three panelists can take that jump ball.
Sure, I can take it quickly from a program admin point of view. So in terms of fees, a couple points. So we do charge a program admin fee, an annual fee of $750 per project for overseeing the project and handling invoices and collections and things like that. We also charge a fee that's sort of on a sliding scale depending on project size at the financial close. And that ranges from 0.5% to 1.25%. And that whole schedule is in the program guidelines, which is available at philadelphiacpace.org. And then some of these other fees that you mentioned in your question are really soft costs, lender fees, the appraisal, the environmental, the engineering survey would be another one. So there are a number of soft costs associated with doing a CPACE project. And you can include soft costs that are related to the installation of the CPACE measures or the diligence and underwriting of the CPACE financing in your CPACE financing amount per our program guidelines.
Okay. Let's see. Thank you.
Hey, Adam, I have a question. This is Eric.
Yeah, sure.
So for Mary Rose and Tim, how has the current environment we were in affected you in relation to closing deals? I'll give you an example. The transaction that I mentioned earlier that we went to go close 2 weeks ago, it turns out that we literally could not get the notary to come out of their house to go get the document notarized. And then we were structurally, and that, by the way, I hear is also happening across other CPACE lenders and mortgage lenders. So they couldn't really get the documents moved along. And then the second thing was about how is the recording process structured, Tim? Is it an electronic recording process, or is it a manual recording process, or is it by county in Pennsylvania? Because we basically literally had to go find electronic recording, which we record in some places, not others. And I've got a whole bunch of deals in San Francisco. I can't record to cause the pace to happen because of the fact that it literally is physical recording in San Francisco. Hard to believe in 2020, but that's where they are. So how is that process of actually closing a PACE working, and are you seeing or experiencing any issues?
Sure. Just sort of generally, I think, a PACE is just nothing unique about where PACE, Eric, would fall into that sort of the current sort of dilemma. Recording will vary from county to county in Pennsylvania. Some are super duper organized, others not so. There is, as people would imagine, an awful lot of interest, and it tends to be state law driven now, Pennsylvania, and in terms of interest in having remote notaries and the applicable state laws that govern that. Some states have it, some states don't. There's actually some federal legislation that's pending on virtual notaries that hasn't yet been signed, but would establish a baseline in states that don't have it. So part of it is title companies are going to have to offer some guidance as to what they're prepared to insure, and people are going to have to be creative. I mean, offices are closed to a large degree. The Delaware Secretary of State's office is still open, but it's going to require some workarounds and people being creative, and definitely involving title companies and discussing what they may be willing to insure, or what they may not be willing to insure, as viewing as sort of a impermissible risk. So evolving.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we literally had to You know, that we couldn't get the notary. We were running around trying to find a notary with a face shield and a hazmat suit in order to close the deal.
Yeah, it's
The guy's doing a lot of business right now. So we have one more question coming in. It's from Ryan Hast. It says, does CPACE in Philadelphia County and across the state simply show up as a single line item on the county property tax bill? So this is kind of a good follow-up question to, you know, sort of procedures and paperwork and whatnot. So how does this show up at the end of the day? Probably a Mary Rose question, I think.
Yeah, so in the Philadelphia CPACE program, your CPACE assessment actually will not show up on your property tax bill. You'll get a separate piece of paper, an invoice from PEA, the program administrator, when you get your property tax bill. So the city sends their property tax bills in December. PEA will send the CPACE bills in December. Both bills must be paid by March 31st, and the you know, pursuing delinquencies and then enforcement follow the exact same procedures, but technically you get a separate piece of paper for your CPACE assessment in Philly. And just to jump back to the question that was asked earlier about, you know, getting signatures and recording, I do want to just note that PEA is set up to e-record for financial close here in Philly. So FYI.
That's good. Okay. So I'm just going to take a quick scroll up the question list here. I think we're done, but let's see. And then I think we're done. So thank you guys on the questions. As far as next steps go, this is the first of a 4-part webinar series. So anyone who attended this webinar, we assume you might be interested in the second one, unless we've completely bored you today. So we'll be sending you out an invitation to that. We'll also be sending you out a recording. I know somebody asked that in chat. So we will send out a landing page that has this video on it. You can come and visit this, this webinar again. And that same landing page will eventually host all 4 in the series. So thank you to my panelists. Thank you to our guests. Look for a follow-up email. If you want to mark your calendar early, it's same time, different web address, but same time next week, Tuesday, 3:30 Eastern. And thank you very much. I'm going to end the call in 10 seconds. So take care, guys. Bye-bye.